Tracy Martin.
Kia ora, Mr Chair. And that was fascinating. I think the people of New Zealand have just seen slogan number 1 for the 2014 election campaign. Well, at least the one in Hamilton where Mr Bennett will be campaigning. And I find it fascinating that that Mr Bennett has actually read some of the figures to do with the bill. I think that's great. Thank you very much, Mr Bennett. That's an improvement on past performances. So losing the light show that we just had, let's actually go back to the real world and the practicalities of how this will affect New Zealanders as opposed to the little electioneering that we just saw. And I'm really pleased that there's a minister in the chair, and I hope that the minister may be able to answer these questions, although not sure it's the right minister in the chair. So let's get real. We're talking about section 162A, 162B. This is the one we're going to focus on in part 1 to start with. And it's about arresting your citizens at the border. So let's talk practicalities, shall we? Let's talk about the fact that as a New Zealand citizen who has an overseas debt comes into the country, they swipe their passport, no different than when a New Zealand citizen leaves the country and they swipe their passport. I'm going to make a huge leap here. I'm going to make an assumption here that when you swipe your passport coming into the country, it's exactly the same passport you swipe as you go out of the country, which means that if an alarm can go off on your way out, an alarm can go off on your way in. And I would ask the Minister to address the question that New Zealand First has. And as a previous debt collector, I'm looking for practical ways that we can actually collect debt from the people that we're trying to collect it from. So if a New Zealand citizen swipes their passport on the way into the country and they have an outstanding debt, an alarm will go off. Not a physical alarm, but a bleep in a computer system somewhere that says to the customs services, uh-oh, we need to actually hold this person for a moment because there's something that the government wants to talk to them about. Now, if we do that on the way into the country, the person now can provide you with details of possibly bank accounts, now can provide you with a third-party contact list, now can actually sit down before they go off to their wedding or off to their tangi or whatever it is and come to an arrangement. If there is a mistake in the record keeping of inland revenue, and I know that many people think that might be far-fetched, but believe me, it is true. The Inland Revenue Department does make mistakes. If there is an error in the data from Inland Revenue that says this person owes a debt and yet they do not, we have avoided a situation by which that person, who would then be pulled from a line as they're leaving the country, loses their flights, their family. I'm not sure I would leave without my husband and my children if I was leaving the country, if he was hauled off by the police because of some debt that apparently he owed the New Zealand government. If we do it on the way into the country, there's no loss of airfares, there's the time that there is to actually sort out the problem. If there's an error with the Inland Revenue Department, there's a time to complete paperwork, all in a practical and all in a very supportive way for a win-win situation here. Now, I'd like the Minister to answer why it was chosen as a point of exit as opposed to a point of entry. I'd love for the Minister or anybody that was actually on that select committee to tell me, was it discussed? Was it ever discussed? Because I'm asking you, Mr Hayes, you're the people putting up the bill. If you don't know it, then who does? It is the National Party that is putting forward this bill, and it is for the National Party to explain to the people of New Zealand why you will arrest them as they leave their country. It is not for me to explain your policies. It is for you, sir, to understand why your government has decided to arrest New Zealanders as they leave, as opposed to creating exactly the same system, exactly the same amount of cost, exactly the same amount of paperwork, and yet the possibility of a truly win-win outcome. So I ask the Minister, will you stand and actually answer why the concept of actually identifying these people on entry as opposed to exit is not inside this bill? And if you can justify it, that's brilliant. But I'm picking from Mr Hayes' contribution that actually you can't justify it. Now, let's go to point number 2. Perhaps the Minister can explain this. What's the rush? What's the rush to force this through? Committee stage, third reading, push it through. I tell you what, I know the answer to the same question, Mr Hayes, but I'm quite sure you don't. And what it is because that on the StudyLink website, It's already advertised. It's already advertised, Mr. Chair.
Tracy Martin.
It's already advertised as being in law that this government will arrest New Zealanders. So we now have to rush in this House, go into extended hours and so on and so forth, to put into place legislation so that what has been placed already up on StudyLink, what is already concerning New Zealand citizens overseas, can actually be a law. Because right now, this is fraudulent. This is fraudulent because it's not law. There's no guarantee it will pass, except that this government is arrogant enough to believe that not one of their minor parties will have the audacity to actually change their view. Now, I'd also like to ask the Minister in the Chair, let's talk about Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett talking about hard-working people, etc., and those. It's actually not young people that most of this debt belongs to. 14% of this particular debt that we're talking about are from borrowers from 1992. So let's not place this on the young people again, shall we? These are the figures inside the government's own report that unfortunately it would appear that the government has not read. So 14% of the outstanding amounts are from borrowers from 1992. Now what this tells you is that it is unlikely you're going to get that amount of money. And that's 14% of the numbers of borrowers, not 14% of the amount of the overdue outstanding. Now let's go to the outstanding. Let's go to the fact that the Inland Revenue Department, and perhaps the Minister would like to answer this, the Inland Revenue Department only recognises debt as overdue debt when it's 5 years or more. Now, even though we just recently changed the repayment holiday for overseas-based borrowers to 1 year repayment holiday, prior to that it was a 3-year repayment holiday. Why on earth would you allow, or why on earth would you not recognise at the end of that 3-year period that this is now an overdue debt? As a debt collector, the reality is the longer you don't make contact there with that person, the less likelihood there is that they will pay it. So where is it inside this bill, or where is it inside any legislation or any discussion, Minister, is it that the Inland Revenue Department have been told to recognise overdue debt in the future as that is perhaps 14 months old, so that they start making contact in a time frame by which it is possible to collect? The next point is, how has the passing of the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism or Countering Financing of Terrorism Act 2009 affected the ability of borrowers to repay? Has anybody asked? Because the banks are currently looking at that. The banks are currently looking at the 4 groups of our citizens that have been disadvantaged by that particular act, the Money Laundering Act. It is an unintended consequence of that act that if you are overseas and trying to send money back to New Zealand, there is now a great deal more paperwork and a great deal more cost to you to do so. So have the Inland Revenue Department, has the department or the advisors to the Minister looked at how that 2009 Act has affected the ability of these people to pay? Is it about assisting our citizens to pay? Or is it, as the Labour Party says, merely a political ploy for this election? Is it the fact that there's actually nothing else they can get tough on with regard to crime because they don't want to fund police and so on and so forth, so now we're going to just start putting forward sound bites like arresting our citizens at the border for debt? And you get situations like Mr. Bennett, who stands and rants and raves, having generally never read the bill, having generally no concern at all for the New Zealand public or any student anywhere that I have ever seen, but who stands there and starts to use cliches to try and spin what is this bill so that the New Zealand public think they're doing something. And I can guarantee the New Zealand public, particularly if the Minister doesn't get up and answer these questions, this government is not doing something apart from putting in place another nuance to being able to actually arrest their citizens at the border when they see fit. And that, sir, is where we start to tend towards more of a police state. There are more and more and more of these sort of little, this insidious creep, I think it's called, where this government starts to chip away and chip away and chip away at things that New Zealanders can do. And New Zealand, I implore you, listen to people like Mr. Bennett. Listen to him very, very carefully and see there is no content whatsoever to what Mr. Bennett said. and have a look at what they are chipping away, because this will be your son, this will be your daughter, this will be your grandchild before you know it.
Poto Williams.